You know, there's a piece of high-end technology we all use every single day, but we almost never think of it that way. I'm talking about story. And what we're going to explore here is how story isn't just for entertainment. It's actually one of the most powerful survival tools our species has ever invented. So let's just start with this big central puzzle, right? We humans have clawed our way to the top of the food chain by being incredibly pragmatic. So why in the world would we spend thousands of hours of our lives burning precious energy on things that just aren't real? I mean, novels, movies, myths, even just gossiping about stuff. What is the evolutionary payoff for make-believe?
Well, the answer, as we're about to see, is that story is anything but a frivolous decoration on human life. It's the very infrastructure of how we think, how our societies work, and how we manage to cooperate. You could even say it's the software that runs on our human hardware.
Okay, so to really get this, we've got to look inside the black box. What is actually going on in your brain when you get totally lost in a good book or a movie? Turns out it's way more active than you might think.
It all kicks off with this foundational human skill called theory of mind. Now, this is just our basic ability to understand that other people have thoughts, feelings, and goals that are totally different from our own. It's the absolute bedrock of social life, right? And, as it turns out, it's also the engine that drives how we process stories. When we read about a character, we're constantly using our theory of mind to figure out why they're doing what they're doing. And this brings us to what I think is the most powerful metaphor for what story does for us. It's a flight simulator for our social lives. Seriously, think about it. A flight simulator lets a pilot practice navigating really dangerous situations, like engine failure or terrible weather, all from the safety of the cockpit. Well, stories do the exact same thing for the crazy complexities of our social world.
And here's the wild part. This isn't just a clever metaphor. Neuroscience studies using fMRIs show us that when you read about a character running, the motor cortex in your brain actually lights up. When a character feels heartbreak, your emotional centers fire up. Your brain is processing their experiences as if they were your own, barely making a distinction between a vividly imagined story and a real event.
So what's the big takeaway here? This simulation gives us a massive evolutionary advantage. We get to practice navigating betrayal, we get to practice forging alliances, making tough moral choices, all without any real-world cost. We get to learn from a character's mistakes so we don't have to make them ourselves. It's an incredible hack.
So you can see how this cognitive technology scales up, right? It starts in the individual brain, but it ends up weaving the very fabric of our societies. It doesn't just help us survive as individuals, it's literally what allows us to build civilizations.
And that brings us to a really critical distinction: the difference between data and myth. You see, a spreadsheet can give you all the facts and figures in the world, but it almost never changes your behavior. A story, or a myth, does something totally different. It takes all that complex information and wraps it up with characters, intentions, and consequences. It gives us a moral compass and a sense of identity that raw data just can't touch.
And this whole process starts with you, with the self. The psychologist Dan McAdams points out that we are all constantly telling a story about ourselves, to ourselves. We take all the random events of our lives, the good, the bad, the triumphs, the traumas, and we weave them into a coherent narrative identity. This story is what gives us a stable sense of who we are, where we came from, and where we think we're going.
Now, what works for one person also works for the group, but on a mind-blowing scale. I mean, how is it possible for millions of total strangers to cooperate? It's because they believe in the same shared stories. Just think about money. A dollar bill is just a piece of paper, right? It has zero objective value. But because we all believe in the story of its value, we can build these massive global economic systems. The historian Yuval Noah Harari calls this an imagined order, a powerful fiction that we all agree to live by.
This really shows you the power of story for civic life. Fictional worlds aren't just a form of escapism. They're more like laboratories for imagining better ways to live together. They let us simulate new kinds of institutions, model different ways of cooperating, and crucially, they make alternative futures feel believable and actually achievable.
Okay, so we've covered the what and the why. We get that story is this incredibly powerful cognitive tool. So how do we actually use it effectively? You know, whether you're building a curriculum, designing a product, or trying to create some kind of change, there are rules to this technology. Let's break down 3 of the most important ones.
First up, rule number 1. And this one is all about the experience.
Let's go right back to that flight simulator. Look, the best stories don't preach. They don't just hand you a list of instructions and say, do this. Instead, they create an immersive experience. They drop you right into a situation and let you learn by living through a character's choices and, of course, their consequences. The goal is always active participation, not just passive reception.
All right, that brings us to our second principle, which is all about where the actual meaning of the story comes from.
This flows directly from that first rule. If you're not supposed to be instructing, then where does the meaning, the so-called moral of the story, come from? Well, it comes from the architecture of the story itself. The theme isn't what a character says, it's what the story proves through its chain of cause and effect. The meaning is revealed through the plot, not just explained in a line of dialogue.
And finally, our third rule. Now, this one is absolutely crucial for navigating the complexity of our modern world.
Think about it. In today's world, which is pluralistic and often pretty skeptical, those rigid, top-down myths, they just don't work as well. People don't want to be told what to believe. So effective modern narratives provide frameworks for thinking, not cages for thought. They offer tools and patterns that help people make sense of their own lives rather than prescribing one single correct path.
So what does that mean in practice? Well, a narrative framework respects your autonomy as an audience member. It invites you to reflect, to question, and to find your own meaning inside the story. It becomes a resource that you can use, rather than a doctrine you have to follow.
So here's the bottom line. Stories aren't just reflections of the world. They are the very tools we use to build it. From our own personal identity all the way up to our global institutions, pretty much everything is built on narrative. And that leaves us with a pretty profound question. Since you are an active participant in this whole process, what new story will you tell?